we got a good conceptual grounding in the first session, and in many ways now as we turn to the questions of priorities and what actually should be done in what kinds of sequences and strategies for fragile states, we start with two failed or at least suboptimal models. On the one hand, there's the one-size-fits-all template, which we all know by now doesn't really work. We have to take into account the unique dynamics and aspects of different societies and different situations. On the other hand, we have the toolbox and pure improvisation and make it up fully each time we do one of these kinds of strategies. Clearly, that also doesn't quite work. We don't learn from our experience. We waste time and energy trying to figure out things that we actually could draw from past experience. So with that now, Ambassador Dobbins will talk about these questions about priorities and the key tasks from the angle of post-conflict societies, and then Michael will pick up from the fragile pre-conflict societies questions. Ambassador Dobbins.
Thank you. In the series of volumes we've done at RAND looking at post-conflict reconstruction, we have set out what we believe to be a prioritization of tasks in a post-conflict environment. And I would stress that we use the term prioritization rather than sequencing, because we're not arguing that that you can't start task 2 until you've finished task 1, or that you necessarily need to sequence them. Rather, it's a question of allocation of resources, and we are arguing that you don't resource task 2 unless you're confident you've adequately resourced task 1, and it's so far down the list. Now, the list that we've hit upon is the following. The first priority is security. If you can't assure security, in our judgment, anything you spend on the second and third order tasks is likely to be wasted, likely to be washed away like sand on a beach. The second priority, and again, this is not sequencing, is humanitarian assistance. It's food, it's medicine, it's shelter, it's refugee return, those kinds of issues. The third priority is what we call basic governance or basic public services. It's reopening the schools, reopening the hospitals, picking up the garbage, providing, turning back the water, providing basic public services. The next priority, I can't remember whether we're on 4 now or 5, 4 is democratization or political reform, if you will. It's constituting a legitimate authority, which is usually missing in the early stages of a post-conflict environment. That is to say, the governance section comes before the democratization section. You know, elections take a while to organize. You've got to pick up the garbage and turn the water on right away, and you're not going to do it. Someone in the indigenous population is going to be teaching the schools and performing these other public services. And it does mean that you have to be careful who you empower in this stage. At that stage, you're allocating resources and thus empowering elements of the society who are subsequently going to compete for in the broader political stakes. And so there are important decisions that are made in this stage that tend to color subsequent decisions. So the next is political reform. It's constituting a legitimate authority. Democratization is the usual technique. And it's not, there are some people who argue this is sort of a Western imposition of foreign systems, but if you think about it, in most cases, there's really no practical alternative to constituting an authority based on some form of popular sovereignty and representative elections. In most cases, in a post-conflict environment, whatever the pre-existing source of authority has been either destroyed, eliminated, or so thoroughly discredited that it can't simply be reimposed. There are exceptions. Actually, the only exception I can think of was Kuwait. We liberated Kuwait. We just turned it back over to the royal family, and nobody raised any questions. It was a legitimate authority. It was internationally recognized, and the people of Kuwait were perfectly happy. They weren't clamoring for democracy. They were happy to have Saddam gone and the Kuwaiti royal family back. That's very seldom the case, that you have that option. In most cases, the option of returning to some traditional form of authority doesn't exist. It's been destroyed or thoroughly discredited by the conflict. And so you have to constitute some new form of authority. And, you know, it's not, maybe 30 years ago there was a debate about whether you wanted to use a communist system or a Western democratic system. There's no debate today. China votes for democracy every time it comes up in the Security Council. They're not arguing that Maoism is an alternative approach, and neither is anybody else. I mean, the only theoretical exception out there probably would be Sharia law based on some sort of theocratic model. But other than that, there really is no alternative to representative government, popular sovereignty, and choosing systems. So that's the next stage. And then the last stage, the lowest priority, is economic. I'm sorry, let me go back. I skipped one. Before democratization, the next priority on the list is what we call economic stabilization. And by that we mean stabilizing the currency, reopening the borders, reopening markets, taking other short-term immediate measures to allow commerce to begin flowing again. These are virtually cost-free. They don't require any investment. They're often very difficult because they tend to challenge existing patterns that have grown up in the conflict and reward or disadvantage various power groups as you try to do this. So it's a delicate operation, but it's an important operation. And it's one that doesn't require money, but it does require a lot of money, but it does require very sophisticated knowledge of how to rebuild the central bank system, get the banks running again, those kinds of steps. Then democratization is the next step, and the last step is long-term development, particularly large-scale infrastructure spending. Certainly in what we call the governance stage, where you're turning the water and the electricity and the schools and the hospitals back on, there's some infrastructure, that is, you're repairing holes in the roof. You may be doing emergency repairs to the generators and other things, but you're not improving the infrastructure. You're simply trying to get existing infrastructure operating again. And so the lowest priority is long-term development and large-scale infrastructure improvement. Now, as I said, these are not sequence necessarily. If you have enough money, you can do all of them simultaneously, and if you have enough manpower and enough expertise. So we're not arguing that you do some things later, but we are arguing that you resource them in that priority, and that you make sure that you're not resourcing lower level priorities until you've satisfactorily resourced higher ones. There are sequencing that obviously take place. I mean, you can't hold elections for a certain amount of time. There is an argument that the longer you postpone elections, the better election you'll have, but that usually comes up against the counter priority, which is to constitute a legitimate local authority so that you, the intervening authority, aren't having to govern this place for an extended period of time, in part because you'll probably do it badly, but also because you don't want to in most cases. It's very expensive. And so the combination of those puts pressure on to move forward with some process of selecting a government with a degree of local and international legitimacy earlier rather than later. This clearly subordinates both democratization and economic development to a higher set of goals, and both sequences them and suggested that they are not necessarily the overriding objectives of an intervention. And that is my view. The United States doesn't invade poor countries to make them rich. We don't invade authoritarian countries to make them democratic. We sometimes invade violent countries to make them peaceful. And the UN is the same thing. The UN doesn't send peacekeeping forces to poor countries so that they become rich, or to authoritarian countries so they become democratic. The UN dispatches military forces to violent countries so they become peaceful. And so the objective of that exercise, the exercise that involves the presence of foreign troops, is peace. And the criteria for success is not whether you leave behind a more just society, but whether you leave behind a society that's at peace with itself and its neighbors. Now, you have other objectives that transcend that and go longer that are directed to making it a more just society, but they're not linked to they're not the preeminent goal of the post-conflict phase in which you're deploying military force as a component of a broader strategy designed to turn a violent society into one that's at peace. So what role does economic and political reform have in that process? I'm not suggesting that it doesn't have a central important role. I'm simply suggesting that it isn't the preeminent objective or the criteria by which you measure success or failure in the intervention. In a post-conflict environment, the objective is to redirect the competition which exists in every society for wealth and power from violent means to peaceful channels. So in most cases, you're trying to co-opt the various competing factions and forces in that society and persuade them to continue their competition through more acceptable means. And you do that by offering them incentives which suggest that they can achieve some, if not all, of their objectives through these more acceptable means. And so that means that you structure your economic and political reforms not around theoretical or abstract notions of political representation and economic justice, but around measures that will have the effect of redirecting that competition among the power centers in that society toward more acceptable goals. Now, occasionally, if you intervene with overwhelming force, you can decide you're going to change the social dynamics of that society fundamentally, that you're going to bar certain elements from competing even peacefully. So you go into Germany and you say, sorry, Nazis, you're out. And you're going to be out forever. And you're not going to compete. And we're not going to try to co-opt you. But, we did that in post-war Germany. We had 1.7 million American soldiers in the American sector of Germany. They only had 17 million Germans. So it was one soldier for every 10 citizens. And so you had the kind of coercive power and international legitimacy and support, because there were another 4 or 5 million Russians and French and British who had the same objective, that you could enforce that. But that's almost never the case. I mean, some people thought that was our goal in Iraq, and clearly that was beyond the capacity of a 100,000-man force in a society of 25 million people to force that kind of permanent social change. But you can co-opt forces, and that was essentially the measure that was chosen in Japan, where we not only kept the emperor, we kept the prime minister, the courts, the parliament, the ministries, and the bureaucrats. There was some equivalent of denazification, but it was much milder, about 90% less extensive. And it was clearly a strategy of co-option rather than what I would call deconstruction. And it was a much more cost-efficient way of proceeding. You can argue that the German transformation was more far-reaching and more thoroughgoing. Germany is reconciled with its history and its neighbors in a way that Japan isn't. But still, the Japan example has a lot of attraction in terms of the cost-effective approach. So that's our vision of sequencing and, more importantly, of prioritization. And it does put security first. And as we saw in Iraq, and for that matter, Afghanistan, you can put a lot of money into a chaotic situation, and it's completely wasted. It has no effect at all. It's only when you begin to provide a more secure environment that those kind of investments in political and economic change can make a difference. And I would say one last word in terms of this prioritization, that the economic growth will occur even if there's no development assistance whatsoever. That if people stop killing each other and go back to work, that society is going to go from negative economic growth to positive economic growth. That's not to say that assistance isn't appropriate, But leaving humanitarian assistance aside, if you go through these stages and never get to, I guess, stage 6, economic development, which is where you often end up in UN interventions because there's never very much development assistance available, you get societies that move from negative growth to positive growth. The best example, of course, of that is Japan, which never got any assistance. Germany did. Japan didn't. And finally, there's an endless argument in the community we represent as to what the relationship is between economic and political reform, and there's an easy assumption, because we call this reconstruction, that economic reform comes first, that first you make people prosperous and then you make them democratic. That's in fact not the historical pattern. That's not what we did in Germany and Japan. In Germany, they didn't get any assistance until 1948. In Japan, they never did. By then, all of the political reforms had been implemented, and the economic growth didn't come until significantly later, until the 50s. It certainly consolidated democracy. It made it attractive. It tended to equate the two in the eyes of the local populace. But the economic reforms and the resumed economic growth, but the political reforms and the resumed economic growth came at an earlier stage. And so our view is that while there is a link between the two, and it is a reciprocal link, that is, economic development can support political reform, and vice versa, and in particular that economic development can support security, and vice versa. The dominant link is between security and political and economic development, with security having preeminence. That is, if you establish security, you'll get economic development even if you do absolutely nothing to promote it, simply by taking a society that's in negative growth because they're killing each other and moving it into positive growth. Economic assistance still makes a lot of sense. A post-conflict society can absorb a higher proportion of its GDP usefully than a stable society. I don't remember the exact figures, but it's like 6 or 8% of GDP. Anything more than that in a stable society is going to be wasted. They can't absorb it. In a post-conflict society, 20 to 40% of GDP can be absorbed usefully. And for every dollar, you'll get more growth. The growth rates that will be stimulated by assistance in a post-conflict society are much higher than the growth rate that would be achieved in a similar society at a similar level of economic development, but was stable. So they're very attractive candidates for aid, but the aid is not an essential component in moving them from being violent societies to peaceful societies. Aid, again, just specify, development assistance as opposed to aid in the other steps, which is essential, security, governance, etc. Those things do have to be funded, and they have to be funded externally in most cases.
Thanks, Ambassador Dobbins. Michael.
Thanks, Lawrence. Well, what I'm going to try to do is glean from mainly the case study literature, comparative research on a number of fragile transitioning states, states like what Jack and Monty were mentioning, are moving from an autocratic kind of system to a more pluralistic, if not necessarily a democratic form of government. And the sort of key question here is, what can we learn from this research in terms of where, what has been done, where potential conflict, these transitioning societies are called anocracies, are among the most vulnerable, as Jack's and other people's research has shown, Monty's, to instability and breakup and violent conflicts. So, but in not all cases has that happened. The international community in various ways has intervened peacefully, or mainly peacefully in the cases I'm looking at, to head off disintegration and conflict. So we're talking about a situation where disputes are arising, groups are beginning to notice that they have conflicting interests. They're freer to mobilize, to gather an ethnic or religious or regional constituency. They may be able to have some access to some arms, so violent incidents may be occurring. the state, in the meanwhile, is beginning to lose control. You can think of the transition in Yugoslavia, where the republics, the leaders of the republics, were finding it more and more difficult to cooperate on basic policy questions in the early 90s. And so the regulative system is beginning to weaken, that normally reconciles the interests between different groups. It's in a way, it conjures up the ideas that Monty was mentioning in terms of polarization and factionalism. Just to kind of place this phase of things in our minds more clearly, I've used this conflict curve graph to illustrate the idea of a cycle of conflict. And what Jim Dobbins has talked about mainly is this stage of post-conflict peace building. What I'm going to talk about mainly is the other form of conflict prevention, which sometimes has been called primary prevention as against secondary prevention. And this graph helps to sort of sort out the terminology as to what levels of violence and what stages over time conflicts can, over many years, evolve. But the main point here is just to focus our attention on what stage we're talking about here. At this point, in these particular cases of transitioning societies, there's some kind of an equilibrium. There's some kind of a social compact. In the communist countries, you had a relationship, you had an agreement, the brotherhood of encompassed within socialism and so on, where the regime was providing benefits. There was an agreement that, only through a rather organized way of relating the state to ethnic groups and so on, there would be stability maintained and so on. But there's some kind of an understanding as to how the system is supposed to work. That's what begins to break apart and disintegrate. It's interesting that this whole discussion that we've been having on this subject this morning so far is being discussed extremely actively in certain compartments and circles within the Defense Department. And I just noticed not too recently, or not too long ago, that a similar, in a sense, a similar graph was devised by the Defense Department, in which what I was talking about is sort of the pre-conflict stage, where systems are breaking down, have not had wars recently, but are evolving from one kind of arrangement to some unknown way of governing. That phase in Defense Department terminology is called phase 0, or you might say that it actually lapses into also to phase 1. And it's interesting to see what the terminology, I mean, really, a lot of our problem now is understanding how different professions, how different agencies use words, and what are the underlying concepts behind those words. There's a lot of similarity in this notion of an early stage of conflict, but it's being discussed differently. So, in terms of what is meant by what you would do at that stage, the words shaping, theater shaping, and global shaping. Basically, that's what I'm talking about, is how one could effectively act, engage in various ways, where early warning systems have put countries on the radar screen, and what's the experience in dealing with those situations since the end of the Cold War. I would make a further argument that although Paul Collier's calculations that post-conflict states are very frequently the ones that become failed states or lapse back into conflict, and that is quoted time and time again in Washington as a reason for addressing post-conflict states, and there's very good reasons for doing that. I would make another argument along the lines that the previous panelists were making, really, that one shouldn't ignore the possibility of new conflicts getting on the radar screen. I mean, Pakistan wasn't exactly, although it's been on early warning lists for some years, it's been sort of moving up lately, wasn't exactly seen as a high priority until relatively recently. Is not a post-conflict state. And there's various reasons why keeping our attention from being sucked continuously to only the post-conflict situations is important. One is that if you just take some of those 5 or so fragile state listings, rankings, I just did a real quick survey of them, and 10 to 16, depending on which list you look at, of the most fragile states at the top of the list were not post-conflict, but new ones. And interestingly, besides Pakistan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Nigeria, Guinea, Zambia was on one of them too. Paul Collier's estimates, somebody actually noticed that he had actually been lowering the percentage of post-conflict countries that had relapsed into conflict. And the Human Security Report actually indicates that there's been a slight uptick in new conflicts recently. And one can argue, as many people do, including the National Security Council and so on, that the overall trends like globalization, youth bulge, climate change, the ready access to arms, and so on, are creating some challenges that particularly anocratic systems, the quasi-democratic systems, are transitioning, former authoritarian or autocratic systems are particularly unable to deal with. That those forces are presenting significant challenges to stability, and we need to be paying attention to that problem. And obviously, obviously preventing wars saves more lives, but there's also some interesting data on the cost differences between how much it costs to invest in conflict prevention compared to the costs for dealing with peacekeeping and post-conflict tasks. And the ratios are really quite huge. In the studies that I could refer you to, the average ratio was $1 spent for prevention compared to $59 spent for post-conflict activities. As I mentioned, there have been a number of examples of conflicts that have been prevented. So how can we get ahead of the game? What can we learn from these cases? In other words, how can we shape the environment at phases 0 and phase 1? There's a number of lessons that I won't go through all of them. I'll pick out a few of them just to illustrate, and then try to see how this relates to the sequencing and prioritization question. I wouldn't say that these are exactly sequenced, that they are, you could call them important priorities, things that need to be emphasized early rather than late. In a way, I agree with what Jim Dobbins just said in terms of not thinking of this in terms of strict sequencing, 1, 2, 3, 4. However, some things, as he also was saying, seem to be needed before other things are possible, such as security first. So in a way, you could say that what we're talking about here is a certain staggering of attention and resources toward different functions. I won't repeat much more about this point about the importance of security first, but there have been some outstanding examples of how in situations where the risk indicators were definitely there, like Macedonia, as Bosnia was falling apart, Macedonia just down the road was being faced by the same kind of tensions. But the UN put in a peacekeeping force before there was any outbreak of violence, and there's a number of studies that have shown that really had a great influence in stabilizing the situation, creating a platform in which the politicians could then get into dialogue, and they were also then invited to do that through international pressure and through international incentives. So security, then diplomacy, to engage the leaders in a society that's in this situation, to come up with a new compact, to come up with new arrangements, new understandings, such as through power sharing, maybe addressing to some extent the fact that people are unhappy with the former regime, but not necessarily moving quickly to punishing them, but allowing leaders who are very unpopular to have golden parachutes and so on. Another somewhat unrecognized insight that comes out of this work, and by the way, I should mention that several people in the audience have contributed to this, including Bill Zartman and King Menkhaus, and probably Terence, in terms of your study of Somalia, for example. And what I tried to do is I tried to pull out from this body of work some of the things that seem to show up in at least one, and hopefully better, several of these case studies. The quantitative research has only begun to be done on this whole question, but I think this is still quite useful as a source of policy guidance. The idea that one needs to pay attention to the anxieties of the dominant group and not come off as simply championing the grievances of an underdog group that may be, in fact, even being repressed. So pushing hard on the human rights question sometimes can either cause backlash or resistance on the part of those who are actually in control. So one has to go at it in a balanced way to recognize that even the junta in Burma, for example, is quite anxious about their status. And one can't simply go at it as if they've got to be eliminated, or they've got to be sidelined or somehow destroyed. So be firm and not vacillating about the need for a peaceful solution. And the way to encourage agreement on a new arrangement needs to draw on both carrots and sticks, such as threatening to withhold visas from key leaders and so on. Conditional aid, one of the most powerful preventive tools in recent history, is the combination of the OSCE's High Commission on National Minorities, who traveled extensively through the Eurasian states, the former Soviet republics, and so on, and combined diplomacy and facilitation with the prospect that these societies and the governments and the leaders could benefit from, if they behave themselves, to put it kind of bluntly, they would benefit by becoming members of NATO, the EU, and so on. This was a powerful incentive for restraining violent behavior in disputes such as between Slovakia and Hungary over the ethnic Hungarians. Cultivate moderate leaders. The USAID, in fact, invested in training the MDC in Zimbabwe, the opposition, in nonviolent tactics. If they had taken the road that the Kosovars did in Kosovo and generated a kind of KLA-type armed movement, that place could be a lot worse than it is. Neutralize neighboring countries so that they don't meddle into the process. Albania was surprisingly restrained for various reasons, but one of which was international pressure from meddling in the ethnic Albanian, ethnic Macedonian situation, and use regional bodies to work through, because they have a certain legitimacy and are seen to be closer to the situation, and they have some kind of acceptance among the leaders. In the medium term, one then gets into what is called structural prevention as against direct prevention. Direct prevention deals with immediate threats to stability, security, that come out of people's, particularly leaders' actions, their behavior, or events that come along that sort of accentuate the divisions, celebrations of holidays of one group or another. that accentuate the divisions in the society. These are sort of short-term things. Structural prevention gets at the environment that shapes the behavior of groups and leaders. Those things can be staggered in terms of the amount of attention given to them, although not put off very long. So even before sort of what Jim was calling long-term development, and here's a difference between post-conflict situations and these transitional situations. You do often have some remnants, or more than that, you have some degree of a functioning state, bureaucracies, civil services, and so on. Some institutions where there might be a little separation in authority among them, some degree of recognition of the ability, the prerogative of parties to represent different points of view and so on, although usually quite controlled. But even, for example, a ruling party might have some elementary rules or procedures for representation. You work with those organizations in order to move them away from personal rule, patronage politics, and so on, to a more rule-governed form of politics and governance, where what we would call here a government of laws rather than a government of men, and usually they are men, prevails. I mean, that's really the important priority, thematically speaking, or conceptually speaking, is to move away from ultimately arbitrary forms of power politics to governments that have institutions where everybody respects certain procedures and prerogatives and divisions of authority and so on. So that there's reciprocity, there's lack of suspicion, that there's more predictability in the behavior of different leaders of different communities. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll move ahead here. A few other things that might not be so obvious. I've sort of mentioned. In addition to addressing economic development needs, social services and economic development needs, which are often, or discrimination, which are often the core grievances, that needs to be done pretty quickly, but it can't be solved. It needs to be started in terms of being visible so that constituents, the grieved parties, can sort of see that something's happening, something's starting. Their plight, as in South Africa, for example, may not improve for some years, and that is becoming a problem there. But at least they get some confidence that something's changing or could change. I've been sort of emphasizing a sort of top-down approach so far, dealing with elites and so on. Civil society, NGOs, and so on are characteristically weak, fragmented, highly politicized. So you can't very quickly rely on them to be an antidote to the machinations of the politicians at the top. However, that effort is important in order to keep the politicians accountable to the rules that they may have agreed to through a new pact. And so that is something that needs to be addressed and so on. It is not a solution to the problem in itself, however. All right. What I think this adds up to is contradictions of a number of conventional wisdoms, such as the idea that you go for root causes and they somehow are going to make all of the other factors, the political competition and rivalry among factions, for example, go away. No, you've got to address those immediate threats and negotiate the politics before you can really have a chance at getting at the so-called root causes. And another thing which is a little different in this, arising from this research, is that force isn't necessarily a last resort. There's this notion that you do diplomacy first and then introduce force later. In fact, because security is so important, either through security sector reform or interpositioning of a peacekeeping force and so on. You need to assure security before the politics can really go on in a relatively unthreatened and more or less a predictable or stabilized way. Obviously, these are patterns. One of the practical implications here is that one does not apply a template to all these situations. It is important to look at some of the lessons and to come up with these kinds of statements as sort of indicators or part of a checklist, but then you take that as a set of hypotheses and look at each particular case and you say, where are the weak spots, where are the capabilities that one can work with before you develop an adequate or what will be an effective strategy. And that then leads us to what we will talk about this afternoon, which is how does one organize a way of identifying these problems, the strengths and weaknesses, and then mobilizing different groups to bring the particular instruments that are addressing the configuration of underlying or more surface problems in a particular place at the right time. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael and Jim, for making very clear propositions that I think we can debate. We don't have much time. I know Jim has to run to another meeting, so let's just go straight to questions, and I'll collect as many as we can and then go to the panelists for their comments. And please introduce yourselves and wait for the mic. First in the back, David, and then in the back center.
This is a question more for Michael than Professor Dobbins, but it's the parallel exercise that I think that has to be undertaken regarding sequencing. It's not just a question of deciding what kind of resources should be allocated when and where, but also the process by which a weak state becomes fragile and potentially collapses and fails. And do we know, or perhaps anyone here could comment on that process in which, drawing on the prior panel, authority structures that are weakened give way to undermining of legitimacy and in turn reduce capacity of that state? Or is there some other causal connection that we should be aware of? Thinking of Pakistan in particular, there's a country that has for the longest time faced authority challenges and legitimacy challenges, but has not been until recently undermined by capacity by virtue of aid. So if one were to engage Pakistan looking at it from a forward-looking perspective and not just shoring up of authority structures, but also looking at legitimacy and capacity, where does one begin? And it seems to me that databases have contribution to make in that regard because we need to know more about the sequences by which states weaken and fail.
Thanks. Right in the center back there. And then right behind you.
Hawa Meskinyar. I spent the last 6 years working in Afghanistan, and this question is for Ambassador Dobbins. I worked both for the Afghan government and also USAID contractors, and wanted to know, in your opinion, what's the most crucial priority area at this point to help reverse its failed or failing state status?
And straight behind you.
A quick question and a comment. I'm John Sewell from the Wilson Center. One is, particularly for Ambassador Dobbins, but anybody else, that in listening to all of this, which is fascinating, I wonder how many case studies there are of failed, what I'll call failed state strategies. That is, where interventions were planned and didn't work. That's before. The second one is, I haven't heard anybody mention, although I came in a little bit late, the impact of the global financial crisis, which seems to me is going to increase the problem, hopefully not exponentially. But if you listen to the Director of National Intelligence, that's the biggest threat facing U.S. interests in the world, not al-Qaeda and other problems. And I don't see that being taken into account. How do you anticipate it? What are and ultimately, Michael, what's the implications for U.S. policy of buffering the impact of the financial crisis?
David and then Neil.
Hi, David Sullivan with the Enough Project at the Center for American Progress. A question for Ambassador Dobbins. Where do you see what we call the rule of law within your prioritization? Is that something that's part of the security, or is that something that is maybe integrated throughout some of those other steps?
Ma'am, and then down here to Neil. Thanks.
Okay. My name is Saira Yamin, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I'm also from Pakistan, and I've lived most of my life over there. With reference to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and especially when Michael Lund, you mentioned that Pakistan is not a post-conflict society, and it's become weaker over the years. I would say that certainly it's become weaker over the years, and as someone who's lived there, I and many of my fellow country people think that U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, the Cold War occupation and interest in the region, and the fact that Afghanistan has been war-plagued for over 30 years have contributed to Pakistan's fragility. And the United States is not really perceived as a force that has tried to build either country and is seen as a meddler in the region. So how would you respond to that, and how would you analyze foreign intervention, military intervention, and imposition of development models in those countries that have been actually counterproductive and have, I don't see evidence of state building in Afghanistan. I see more death and destruction.
Thanks, Neil, and then we'll go to the panelists.
Neil Levine, I'm the Director of the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at USAID. For Ambassador Dobbins, if you were back at the NSC or at the State Department, what two recommendations would you give to the NSC advisor for how we can get more attention, policy attention to the crisis prevention agenda in the midst of two hot wars and bubbling crisis, Sri Lanka, Somalia, pick anyone. And Michael Lund, if you were to pass a note to the next aid administrator, what two recommendations would you give them on the same question in the midst of post-conflict reconstruction activities that are ongoing? What can we be doing further upstream to address crisis prevention issues?
Thanks for all the rich questions. Lots on the table. Let's go to Ambassador Dobbins.
Well, first of all, on what the priority is in Afghanistan, the simple answer would be security, and it was and the reason that that we're in the state we're in now was the failure to recognize that, having toppled the Taliban, it was incumbent on the United States to engage itself in providing for public security in the country that it had just conquered. That's not to say putting American policemen on every corner. It's to say that that an occupying force needs to engage in peacekeeping. And the failure of the U.S., the decision not to allow foreign peacekeepers to go outside Kabul for 2 years after the Taliban fell, and the refusal to allow U.S. forces to engage in any public security or peacekeeping operations for the first several years, allowed the reemergence of an organized violent resistance movement. And it failed to secure and gain the loyalty of large elements of the population who are now in contested areas. And so, there's lots of elements to the Obama strategy. It's a very complex strategy. It has a lot of different components. But since 2007, with Petraeus's move to Iraq, the U.S. has embraced public security as the primary metric for deciding whether it's doing well or poorly in a counterinsurgency campaign. For the first 4 years after we invaded Iraq, we refused to even count the number of Iraqis that were getting killed on the argument that it wasn't relevant. Petraeus, on the other hand, came back and told Congress he was succeeding precisely because less Iraqis were getting killed. That was his metric. And McChrystal, who just testified, said his main metric in Afghanistan is going to be reducing Afghan civilian casualties. whether they're killed by the Taliban or us. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. If they're getting killed, they're going to feel insecure, and if they're going to feel insecure, they're going to fail to cooperate in marginalizing the extremists. Now, there's lots of other problems in Afghanistan: corruption, lack of adequate government services, and inability to deliver those services at any distance from Kabul. I'm not suggesting that we should be ignoring a lot of other things, but security is key. Somebody asked whether there are studies of failed post-conflict strategies. Yeah, I mean, we've at RAND, we've done 3 volumes with 22 case studies, and there are clear failures. The first volume looked at the American experience, and it had 8 case studies: Germany, Japan, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan and Iraq. And it found 4 successes: Germany, Japan, Bosnia, and Kosovo, and 4 failures: Haiti, Somalia, and at that point when we wrote, both Afghanistan and Iraq, although those might be turned around. And there were other volumes on the UN and European records. And again, there are clear failures as well as successes. On where the rule of law fits, I mean, you could create a separate category, as I did, and fit it in there somewhere. But in fact, the rule of law tends to come in most of those categories. So in the security category, clearly in that first phase, you are trying to use indigenous forces, not just foreign forces, and you're trying to ensure that those indigenous forces are restrained and non-abusive and follow some basic guidelines in terms of the application of coercion. As you move further to the governance area, in addition to opening the hospitals and the schools, you're trying to reopen the courts and the prisons. And so at that point, some assistance at a basic sort to, again, fix the roof in the courthouse and maybe give the clerk a computer, and doing the same for the prisons is important. When you get to the economic stabilization sector, again, you need to put in arrangements which aren't prone to abuse. And then finally, when you get to democratization, that's the point at which you're talking about reforming the legal codes and to bring them in conformity with international standards. So I think it fits in all of those sectors. And finally, there's 2 questions. One was, what about the U.S. as an unwelcome foreign intervention? In Afghanistan, clearly, the Afghan people wanted more foreign and American intervention back in 2002, 2003, 2004, not less. Afghanistan was the least resourced American nation-building operation in 60 years. The average Kosovar or Bosniak got 16 times more assistance from the world than the average Afghan. And he got 50 times more security in terms of the number of troops that were available to secure his society than Afghanistan. And if you looked and talked to Afghans back in those years, they were asking, where are the Americans? Where are the international community? Not Yankee, go home. And it was the failure to provide that assistance which got us in our current situation. Iraq was a different situation. It was an uninvited invasion, and there was a certain antipathy to the U.S. presence from the beginning. And finally, what should we do? What are the events? I mean, I think the things Michael recommended are all sensible, and I don't have any. I don't think there's any inconsistencies between his prescriptions for the pre-conflict phase and my prescriptions for the post-conflict phase. I do think one big difficulty in applying his prescriptions is that until a society goes through a cycle of conflict, it doesn't accept that it's sick and won't take its medicine. And so many forms of international intervention are simply not acceptable. They're not acceptable to the side itself, who very rarely will take an international force, for instance, Macedonia being an important exception, but an exception that tends to prove the rule. And they're also not acceptable to the international community. Until the international community has had its face ground in the CNN, photographed horror, they're not going to spend the money and deploy the resources that are necessary. So, unfortunately, There are limitations, but I think that the things that Michael have recommended are all very sensible.
Thank you very much, Jim. We're up against time. Michael, in a few minutes, particularly if you can pick up the impact of the global financial crisis and your recommendations for the AID administrator, or other things.
Well, I'll be real quick about all of them. On David's first question about dynamics, interrelationships, and interactions, and so on, I'll just refer him to that complex slide that Monty Marshall introduced earlier, both the one that had the arrows going this way and the one that had the 4 panels of little boxes, all of which is simply an effort, as I understand it, to try to understand some of the patterns in those interactions between different sectors, between different, the problem of authority, legitimacy, and so on, and what affects what, but all of which adds up to simply a more informed theory about some of the patterns. You still have to take that, when it's finished, and apply it to each particular country. And that's where I thought the session, among other things, was really useful in leading us to a logic for how to apply to policy. You take that kind of theory, you form out of it a sort of an analytical framework, and then you use it, you apply it in a particular place to see where the entry points should be and where the capacities are that you can build upon. I'm going to dodge the financial crisis question. Take it up with Jack and David and Monty. I actually asked you guys to address it, but you didn't. But that's fine. Todd Moss has a very interesting study out from the Center for Global Development, in which he says that so far African economies haven't been affected, but they will be because of the decline of remittances and the lack of markets. But they've been shielded to some extent because they're not integrated into the international financial community as much. But that's not going to last long, I think, according to that argument. And, people mention Tajikistan, where the guest workers are coming back from Moscow and have nothing to do in Dushanbe, and so that obviously is a possible risk growing there. The rule of law concept has always been too vague, in my view. It covers so many things that institutions, laws, courts. You can almost anything you can apply it to. So I don't find it it's one of these rhetorical, symbolic kind of concepts that people use, but it doesn't help you. You can't operationalize it unless you break it down into these smaller compartments. The Pakistan problem, U.S. in meddling and so on, again, I was just reminded of Monty's point about how we've been intervening with one particular criterion in mind and concern, and that sort of distorts the situation, has its own effects, creates dependency, does not allow the country itself to face up to many problems, in regard to which it may need help, but our intervention is so heavy-footed sometimes politically that it skews what's really important. And again, these templates or these checklists allow one to take a more balanced, comprehensive approach. The crowning comment here. I don't often have this opportunity, Neil, to as a consultant for USAID sometimes to speak truth to power. But quickly, I would say take the tools that one has in the form of watch lists, conflict assessment frameworks, fragile state frameworks, come up with a integrated framework of some kind, and require the missions in all of the countries that are toward the top of the list, not necessarily the ones in red, but the ones in orange and yellow, to do a rigorous, comprehensive assessment of their state of fragility, where the sectors are that they're weak, where they're strong, as a prelude to a country planning approach, which then could guide the allocation of resources. I mean, this is a very rational logic. Anybody can sort of articulate it. How you actually implement it, given the earmarks, given existing resource allocations and so on is sort of what we're going to talk about in the afternoon. It's a huge, huge, huge problem. The stovepiping structure through which problems are identified, programs are designed, and monitored, decisions are made, and so on, is so strong that it doesn't allow for this lateral, synoptic approach to diagnostics or to programming. But that's where I think things have to move. And the small states can't be ignored. I mean, think of the effects of small states on U.S. foreign policy in the last 15 years. Somalia, Afghanistan, Georgia most recently. These are the tails that often wag the dog. So they need to be included in the purview of these tools.
Great. As I understand, we're going straight into the breakout sessions. So just consult the agenda for which session you're going to go to and where that is. But first, join me in thanking Ambassador Dobbins and Michael.